16 years old. No vocal training. A borrowed jacket 2 sizes too big. When Courtney Hadwin stepped onto the America's Got Talent stage in 2018, Simon Cowell leaned back with the look he gives every act he has already decided to dismiss. What happened in the next 4 minutes made him do something cameras had never caught in 23 years of televised auditions. The footage spread to 180 countries within 48 hours. What broke Simon Cowell that night, and what Courtney had been carrying long before that stage, nobody outside her hometown knew. Wynyard is not the kind of place that produces international stars. It sits in County Durham, in the northeast of England, a small post-industrial village where the collieries closed decades ago and left behind rows of quiet streets and people who got on with things without making much noise about it. It is the kind of place outsiders pass through without stopping. The kind of place where extraordinary things are not supposed to happen. Courtney Hadwin was born there in 2004. She grew up in a working-class household, the daughter of parents who were not in the music industry, had no connections to television, and no roadmap for what their daughter was quietly becoming. In school, Courtney was not the girl who raised her hand. She was not the one who stood at the front. Teachers who knew her in those years described a child who moved carefully through rooms, watchful, soft-spoken, someone who seemed to be always slightly on the edge of disappearing. But there was a classroom incident that one of her teachers later recalled, in a 2018 interview with a local Durham newspaper, that stopped everyone in the room cold. Courtney had been asked to sing something simple for a school exercise. Something short. She stood at the front of the class and opened her mouth, and what came out did not belong in that room. It did not belong in that school. It sounded like something that had been building for years inside a very small space and had finally found a crack to get through. The teacher said the other children went completely still. By the time she was 13, Courtney had appeared on a UK talent show, The Voice Kids, in 2017. She made it to the final. The clips circulated online and drew attention from people in the industry who knew what they were looking at. But Courtney herself did not seem interested in what any of that meant. She went home. She went back to school. She sat in the same classrooms. She was still the quiet girl from Wynyard. In 2018, at 16, she auditioned for America's Got Talent. The gap between who she appeared to be and what she carried inside her was, by that point, almost impossible to explain to anyone who hadn't seen it firsthand. She wore clothes that didn't quite fit. She looked at the floor. When producers spoke to her before the audition, she answered in short sentences and gave nothing away. There is a photograph taken backstage at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium in the hour before her audition. Courtney is sitting in a corridor, hands in her lap, looking at nothing in particular. She does not look like someone about to change the trajectory of her life. She looks like someone waiting for a bus. Anyone who grew up shy, who had something inside them that the world couldn't see yet, drop your city in the comments. This story is going to mean something to you. What almost no one knew then was that Courtney had come close to not boarding that plane at all. Someone had persuaded her to go. A single conversation, in the months before the audition, had tipped the decision in one direction rather than the other. Who that person was, and why that conversation had been so difficult, would only come out much later. The Pasadena Civic Auditorium holds just under 3,000 people. When Courtney Hadwin walked out onto that stage in the spring of 2018, those 3,000 people saw a teenage girl in an oversized jacket who looked like she had made a wrong turn somewhere backstage and ended up in front of a microphone by accident. Simon Cowell saw the same thing. He leaned back. Arms crossed. The expression he has worn 10,000 times, polite, distant, already composing the dismissal. Howie Mandel looked at his notepad. Heidi Klum smiled the encouraging smile that judges give acts they are not expecting much from. Mel B waited. Then Courtney opened her mouth. The first note of Janis Joplin's Cry Baby came out of her body like something had been released rather than performed. One note. That was all it took. The audience felt it before they understood it, a physical thing, a pressure change in the room, the way the air shifts before a storm. And then Courtney Hadwin stopped being Courtney Hadwin. There is no other way to describe what happened next that does not sound like exaggeration until the viewer watches the footage themselves. Her body changed. The shy girl who had been staring at the floor seconds earlier was gone. What replaced her moved differently. Arms reaching, hips moving, a voice that stretched and broke and roared in ways that a 16-year-old from a post-industrial village in County Durham was not supposed to be capable of. The Guardian, reviewing the footage weeks later, described it as a transformation so complete it bordered on unsettling. Mel B's jaw dropped. She did not close it for several seconds. Heidi Klum was on her feet within 30 seconds of the first chorus. She was not the only one. The audience came up in waves, sections of the auditorium rising as the performance built, a standing ovation that had started before the song was finished. Howie Mandel later told Entertainment Tonight that watching Courtney perform had felt, in his words, frightening in the best possible way, like something had taken over the room and there was nothing anyone could do about it. The cameras caught the audience. They caught the judges. They caught people in the back rows with their hands over their mouths. But the camera that mattered most was the one trained on Simon Cowell. By the 90-second mark, he had uncrossed his arms. By the 2-minute mark, his expression had shifted into something that had no name in the usual vocabulary of his public face. Not impressed. Not surprised. Something older and quieter than either of those. And then, in the final 30 seconds of the performance, as Courtney's voice climbed to a place that the room couldn't quite contain, Simon Cowell's face did something it had not done in 23 years of television. In 23 years across American Idol, The X Factor, and America's Got Talent, Simon Cowell had been captured crying on camera exactly 0 times. Until this audition. But that was not the most remarkable part. Because before Courtney ever set foot on that stage, Simon Cowell had already seen what she could do. He had watched the footage. He had prepared himself. He had told the people around him that he knew what was coming. And he still wasn't ready. Simon Cowell built his public image with the same precision that he applied to everything else, deliberately, strategically, and without sentiment. The version of Simon Cowell that the world came to know through Pop Idol, American Idol, and The X Factor was not an accident. It was a construction. The black t-shirt. The high-waisted trousers. The slow, flat delivery of a verdict that left no room for negotiation. He became, over the course of 2 decades, perhaps the most recognizable judge in the history of television, not because of what he said yes to, but because of the particular way he said no. In a 2003 interview with GQ, Cowell was direct about it. He said that emotional reactions on television were a form of weakness that he had no interest in displaying. The role of a judge, in his view, was clarity, not feeling. The audience wanted to know the truth. Sentimentality obscured the truth. He held to that position for years. Backstage, the people who worked with him told a different story, or at least a more complicated one. Former X Factor producers, speaking to The Sun in 2015, described a man who cared deeply about the artists he signed, who followed their careers long after the cameras were gone, who made phone calls he didn't need to make and showed up to things he hadn't been asked to attend. One producer said, "The public version of Simon and the private version of Simon are not the same person." But on camera, the armor held. It had been built over a long time and out of hard material. Cowell's early career, before Pop Idol changed everything, was defined by failure. He signed acts that didn't sell. He made decisions that cost money. He had a period in the 1990s where he moved back into his parents' house in his late 30s with very little to show for a decade of work. That experience, by his own account in multiple interviews, changed him. It stripped away the luxury of public vulnerability. When you failed that publicly, he told the Sunday Times in 2009, you learn very quickly that the only useful thing is honesty. About everything. Including yourself. The armor was not cruelty. It was scar tissue. By the time America's Got Talent entered its 13th season in 2018, Cowell had been a television judge for nearly a quarter century. He had watched tens of thousands of performances. He had delivered verdicts that launched careers and verdicts that ended them. He had been called a villain in 100 magazine profiles and had never once appeared to lose sleep over any of them. And then the production team for AGT sent him a clip. It was Courtney Hadwin's audition from The Voice Kids UK the previous year. Standard procedure: judges review notable talent before taping begins. Cowell watched it. Those in the room said he watched it twice, without speaking. When it was over, he said very little. He acknowledged that she was remarkable. He moved on to the next item on the schedule. He had watched the footage. He had seen what she could do. He had a year to prepare himself for the possibility of encountering it live. Producers later confirmed that Cowell requested a second private viewing of Courtney's audition tape before any episode aired. He had never done that. Not once in the show's history. And yet, None of that preparation explained what happened when the music actually started. What happened when that music started, and what Simon said off-camera directly after, is the part that never made the broadcast edit. Subscribe now. This is where it gets real. The performance lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Frame by frame, the footage tells a story that the edited broadcast version only partially captured. Viewer recordings, uncut, from multiple angles, were analyzed across dozens of online threads in the weeks after the episode aired, some of which reached over 2 million impressions. People magazine ran a piece that walked through the judge panel reactions in sequence. What they documented, minute by minute, was not what most viewers had registered in the moment. At the 0-second mark, Courtney stood still at the microphone. The auditorium was quiet. Simon Cowell's arms were folded. At 17 seconds, the first vocal note landed. The fold in Cowell's arms loosened, not dramatically, barely perceptibly. His hands moved to his knees. At 42 seconds, he leaned forward. This is significant. In 23 years of televised judging, Simon Cowell's default posture under neutral conditions was reclined, slightly back, weight resting, a physical signal of detachment and authority. Leaning forward was not something the cameras caught him doing often. When they did, it meant something had earned his full attention. By the 90-second mark, his expression had changed in a way that had no precedent in the archive of his on-camera career. The control was still there, the jaw set, the eyes focused, but something underneath it had started to move. At 2 minutes and 8 seconds, Courtney made eye contact with him directly. Not the sweeping gaze of a performer working the room. A direct, specific, unbroken look, the kind that happens between two people in a private conversation, not between a contestant and a judge on a television stage. She held it for 3 seconds. Cowell did not look away. In a 2019 interview with The Mirror, Courtney was asked what she had been thinking at that moment. She paused before answering. Then she said, "I just wanted him to hear it. I wasn't trying to impress him. I just wanted someone to really hear it." At 3 minutes and 40 seconds, Simon Cowell's eyes filled. He did not wipe them. He did not look away. He sat with it, which for a man who had built an entire public identity around emotional containment, was itself an act of a different kind of courage. The audience was already on its feet. The noise in the room was enormous. And in the middle of all of it, Simon Cowell sat very still, with wet eyes, and said nothing. When the performance ended, the judges spoke in turn. Mel B., Heidi, Howie. When it came to Cowell, he took a breath. His voice, when it came out, was lower than usual. He said that in all his years of doing this, he had never heard anything like it. He said she had something that couldn't be taught and couldn't be manufactured. Then he pressed the golden buzzer. Gold paper rained down from the rafters. Courtney stood in the middle of it with an expression that was not triumph. It was something closer to relief, or exhaustion, or both at once. She put her hands over her face. Courtney's mother, in a 2019 interview with a UK parenting publication, confirmed something that the production team had not known. Courtney had been struggling with severe performance anxiety for years before that audition. Not nerves in the ordinary sense, but a documented chronic fear of being seen that she had told no one on the AGT production team about. The girl who looked like she was waiting for a bus backstage had not been calm. She had been holding herself together with everything she had. But that was not the most disturbing part. Because backstage, within minutes of the performance ending, Simon Cowell pulled a producer aside. The gold paper was still falling. The audience was still cheering. Courtney was still standing under the lights. And Simon Cowell said 4 words that no one in that building had expected to hear from him. He said, "Don't lose this one." 4 words. Quiet. Serious. Addressed not to Courtney, not to her family, but to a producer. As an instruction. As a warning. As something that sounded, to the people who heard it, less like professional advice and more like a man who had just seen something he was afraid of losing. The clip went live and the world came with it. Within 48 hours, Courtney Hadwin's AGT audition had been shared across 6 continents. Within a week, it had crossed 40 million views. The comments ran into the hundreds of thousands, people writing in languages from Japanese to Portuguese to Afrikaans, all saying variations of the same thing. "I don't know what I just watched, but I felt it." Courtney went home to Wynyard. This is the part of the story that the viral clip did not show. The teenager who walked back through the front door of her family home was not the transformed figure that 40 million people had watched on a screen. She was 16. She was tired. And the world that had just opened up in front of her was not something she had been prepared for, or had asked for, or entirely wanted. Her mother, speaking in a 2019 interview with The Telegraph, said that the weeks after the audition were some of the hardest of Courtney's life. Not because anything had gone wrong, everything had gone right, more right than anyone had dreamed, but because going right at that scale brought its own kind of weight. Courtney's performance anxiety had not disappeared when the golden buzzer fell. It had intensified. The difference now was that the entire world was watching. She had been carrying this since before The Voice Kids. Since before any camera had ever been pointed at her. The anxiety was documented. Her family had sought help for it in the years prior, and it ran counter to everything the public saw when she was on stage. The girl who roared like Janis Joplin went home and struggled to be in rooms full of people. Anyone who watched AGT that summer with their kids, their parents, or alone on a couch at midnight, this moment in the story is the one that stays with you. It stayed with Courtney too. In ways nobody talked about publicly. The AGT competition continued. Courtney made it through to the live shows. She performed again and again after that, each time drawing the same reactions from audiences, the same disbelief, the same desperate sharing across the internet. She finished in 4th place in the season 13 finale in September 2018. 4th place. After an audition that had broken a 23-year record on live television. Her father, in an interview with the Northern Echo the following year, was measured but honest about what the competition had cost. She gives everything when she performs, he said. Everything. And that's not nothing. That takes something out of you every time. Then, in late 2018 and into 2019, something happened that the industry noticed immediately. Courtney went quiet. Social media posts stopped. Appearances were cancelled. Press requests went unanswered. The management machinery that had been building around her since the audition suddenly found itself with nothing to manage. She was there, and then she wasn't. The whispers started. Speculation about deals gone wrong. About label negotiations that had turned sour. About a teenager who had been chewed up by the machine she had briefly dazzled. None of it was accurate. Simon Cowell personally reached out to Courtney's family after the season ended, not through his production company, not through a lawyer or a representative. Directly. A personal call. And what he offered them was not a contract, not a management deal, not the standard machinery of the industry he had built his career running. What he offered them was time. And a promise to let her move at her own pace. Nobody in the industry does that. Not at that level. Not with talent that hot. What Courtney decided to do with that time, and the decision she made that nobody in the industry predicted, was something that would only become clear in the months that followed. Courtney Hadwin did not disappear. She stepped back. Deliberately. On her own terms. And then when she was ready, she stepped forward again, but not in the direction anyone had mapped out for her. In 2019, she released independent music. Not through a major label. Not through the Simon Cowell machinery of Psycho or any of the associated industry structures that AGT contestants typically moved through. She worked with producers she chose herself. She released music that reflected what she actually wanted to make, which did not sound like what talent show winners were supposed to